This Sunday, we talked about the original sin with Adam and Eve and how they sinned in the garden. We talked about they were deceived and how Satan just kind of throws them under the bus, and they try to throw each other under the bus, which means they try to blame everybody and they didn't want to take responsibility for their actions. But they do. And what we find here is somebody that's outside of God's grace and wanting to get back into God's grace. And so they try their own means to cover themselves up with fig leaves and different things like that. And God says, that's not the way we're going to do it. We're not going to do it your way. We need to do it my way. And what God ultimately does is he kills the first animal and creates a sacrifice that's acceptable for the covering of their sin for the time being. Ultimately, Jesus Christ is the ultimate sacrifice. But we'll have to wait a couple thousand years before that's going to happen. And so as they're waiting, God kind of ponders a question. He says, can man go on living in the garden? And he ultimately says, no, he can't, because man has brought sin. And if he ever wants to get back to where God is and be holy in God's presence, he needs to eradicate sin from his life. And so God introduces death, and death destroys. It destroys everything. It destroys every living thing, everything that's good. And they're left with something, in a sense, disgusting, which God never intended. And so God wants to get them back right with him. And so he creates the sacrificial place to go. And then we see the next story in the Bible, and it's the story of Cain and Abel. And you wonder, could they have been good enough? Could they have made it maybe in the garden? Maybe Adam and Eve couldn't, but maybe the next generation could. And so you always wonder about that. But in the King James, when it introduces a story, it talks about in the end of days is how it starts that story. And I think it's interesting because that phrase is kind of talking about maybe what you would have in Revelation and how the end of days is going to be and what's going to happen. There's some foreshadowing with Cain and Abel. You see, Abel brings an acceptable sacrifice to the Lord and is pleasing. And you see that in Genesis, but you also see it in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4. It was by faith that Abel brought a more acceptable offering to God than Cain did, and Abel's offering gave evidence that he was a righteous man, and God shows his approval of his gifts. Although Abel is long dead, he speaks to us by his example of faith. And we want to know, what is faith? What does it look like? What is it? Well, if you look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, it says, faith shows the reality of what we hope for and is the evidence of things we cannot see. I kind of think about this like today I was throwing Piper up in the air and catching her. And she said, more daddy, because she had faith in her dad that he was going to catch her. And so as I throw her up, she gets this excited look on her face and is like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? But she sees her dad's hands, they're ready to catch her. And she understands that I have faith that my dad's going to be there. She expects it. And if I were to drop her, how would I crush her in that way? And she wouldn't be upset as much that I dropped her. She'd be upset and say, why did you drop me? Why did you do that? And so me as a father, I could never do that. I'm going to catch her every single time. And we know that it is impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who wants to come to him must believe that God exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So me as a follower, I need to know that my God is there to catch me every single time. And we see that in the story of Cain and Abel. When it comes to Abel, he brought a sacrifice of a lamb that was pleasing to the Lord. And God said, that's good. That's acceptable. I accept you. And when he says acceptable, he's talking about Abel's salvation there. He is allowing Abel to come into faith with him. So his salvation moves to faith, and faith moves forward, and he is an acceptable sacrifice to the Lord. And then we see Abel. And it's really interesting because we see Cain. And what's interesting about Cain is that his sacrifice was one of a grain offering. Well, that's very similar to Adam and Eve when they cover themselves up with the figs and they're like, wow, we can't do this. This is not acceptable. God doesn't deem that acceptable. So why would Cain come with that same thing and try to make it acceptable before the Lord, knowing it didn't work for his parents and that God has established this sacrificial way through this lamb and things. Now, I think Cain may have known that. And I think a lot of times when we sin, we know that it's wrong and we decide to do it anyway. We decide, well, it's okay because God will forgive me. Well, that's kind of what Abel is saying. Well, I didn't have time to buy a lamb off of my brother, so I'm going to just bring this grain offering because it's good enough and it's the best that I have. But it wasn't acceptable. It was trying to cover over something because maybe he didn't have time. But basically what it comes down to is Cain was selfish and it was centered on himself. How do we know that? We look at Genesis chapter 4, verses 8 through 14. In the NLT, it says, one day Cain suggested to his brother, let's go out to the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Afterward, the Lord asked Abel, where is your brother? Where is Abel? Notice how God comes to him and asks him questions, just like he did Adam and Eve. He went and asked the questions. He knew his brother. He knew where Abel was at. He could see the blood. He knows that Abel killed him. And Cain replies, I don't know. Am I my brother's guardian? But the Lord said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are cursed and banished from the ground, which has swallowed your brother's blood. No longer will the ground yield crops for you, no matter how hard you work. From now on, you will be homeless wanderer on the earth. Cain replied to the Lord, my punishment is too great for me to bear. You have banished me from the land and from your presence. You have made me a homeless wanderer. Anyone who finds me will kill me. Well, God says anyone who kills you would get a sevenfold curse on top of you. And so that's not going to happen, Cain. But notice what Cain's concerned about. He's not concerned about his relationship with the Lord. He's not concerned about a broken, contrite heart. He's concerned about what's going to happen to him. Oh, it's too hard for me, Lord. It's too hard for me. And what do we have in the world today? We have a lot of people concerned about me. And they're concerned about their needs and how they're going to take care of themselves. And they're not really concerned about their neighbor. They look and see, oh, well, we may have some volunteer opportunities, but we're going to stay home because that's just, I'm too scared to go out. And I understand if you have a health issue or if you have something that's wrong. But if you're a healthy person and you have an opportunity to serve and you're not within 6 feet of other people, it might be a good idea to go out and serve because God calls us in faith to go and serve and not to sit home in fear and in timidity. Now, on the other side of that too is we have a lack of salvation in Cain. We see Cain outside of himself. He's only concerned about himself. He's not concerned about what the Lord has. And ultimately, what that leads to is death. And that death with the separation from God. Cain is separated from God, and therefore he's going to go to hell. And that is sad because God doesn't want anyone to go to hell. But Cain chooses himself. And that shows the power of free will. God allows us to choose a relationship with him or a relationship without him. Abel chooses a relationship with him, and we find out it goes well with him. We find out that he's with Jesus in heaven. Cain chooses a relationship without him, and we find that it goes a lot harder on earth and in eternity because he's going to have an eternity with hell. I hope you find this encouraging today, and I hope you find that your choice is going to be like Abel, that you choose Jesus. And we all know, especially I know, that your choice is yours. I can't force it on you. It is between you and the Lord. What are you going to choose today?